Hey there, fellow bookworms, and welcome back to the Book Nook podcast. Today, we're diving deep into something that I think is pretty fascinating, the whole world of generational differences. We're going to be looking at how technology has shaped Gen Z and try to figure out why everyone's calling them the anxious generation. We've got two really thought-provoking books to help us unpack all of this. Generations by Jean Twenge and The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt.
It's really interesting. Even though these books are coming at this topic from totally different angles, they both kind of highlight how much the era you're born into impacts how you see things, sometimes even more than how you were raised.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it really makes you think, how different would we be if we were born like a few decades earlier or later?
Yeah.
So in generations, Twenge lays out this really clear timeline, starting with the greatest generation, then the silence, boomers, Gen X millennials, and finally Gen Z. And she kind of connects each generation back to these major cultural events and trends.
What I find fascinating is how those events ripple through the generations. Like, for instance, the greatest generation. They went through the Great Depression, World War II, which really gave them this strong sense of unity and resilience. But then that led to the post-war economic boom that shaped the boomers. And you can see how that led to them putting so much emphasis on individual achievement.
It's like a chain reaction almost.
Mm-hmm.
It makes total sense when you think about how boomers embraced self-help and saw this huge increase in divorce rates. That definitely had a big impact on Gen X, who grew up in a world that felt way less stable.
Exactly. And this all ties back into Twenge's idea that each generation's experiences basically become the lens through which they view the world. It even affects things like parenting styles and values.
Oh, totally. Like, think about the whole self-esteem movement, which became so huge with boomers and Gen X. Twenge suggests that might have accidentally paved the way for what some people see as this rise in narcissism. By the time millennials came along, it makes you think about all the unintended consequences.
Absolutely. And speaking of consequences, let's talk about Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation. His main argument is kind of concerning. He thinks this combination of overprotective parenting, what he calls safetyism, and this explosion of smartphones and social media is basically creating a mental health crisis for Gen Z.
Wait, did you know Joe Biden is the only unwhite president from the silent generation? Isn't that wild? Okay, back to Haidt. That's a pretty heavy claim, right? But it actually lines up with what Twenge was saying about millennials taking longer to hit those traditional milestones, like getting married or starting families. And that trend is even more pronounced with Gen Z. Do you think maybe this whole delayed adulthood is fueling some of that overprotective parenting?
It's definitely possible, and Haidt makes this really interesting comparison. He talks about how parents are super vigilant about protecting their kids from physical harm, which makes sense. But when it comes to the online world, there's this real lack of awareness about the dangers. It's like we're overprotecting them in one area and totally leaving them vulnerable in another.
He even has this one example that's kind of jarring. He describes parents who are meticulously preparing healthy veggies for their kid, while that same kid is online, completely unsupervised, accessing pornography. It's a pretty crazy image. It really highlights that disconnect.
Definitely. And this is where Haidt brings up the idea of the great rewiring. He's basically arguing that all this constant stimulation from social media, video games, the internet in general, is actually changing the way kids' brains develop.
And that is a little scary. And I think a lot of parents are starting to see those effects. Like, one of the biggest things, especially for Gen Z girls, is this intense pressure to have the perfect image online. It's like Instagram. And all these other platforms with their filters and carefully curated feeds are creating this environment where everyone is constantly comparing themselves to each other.
And these platforms are designed to exploit our natural desire for social validation, which makes it even harder to resist. Those like buttons, retweet functions, they give you this instant feedback. And that can be really powerful, especially for a young person's self-worth.
It's not just posting the perfect selfie either. It's the fear of missing out. The pressure to keep up with all the trends, the never-ending notifications, it's all designed to keep you hooked.
If you're enjoying this deep dive into the minds of Gen Z, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and leave us a review. It really helps other book lovers find the podcast. Now, before we go any further, I think it's important to point out the contrast between how kids experience media today compared to previous generations. Like, remember when TV was the dominant form of media? It was this shared experience. Families gathered around to watch the same shows and then talked about them afterwards.
Right. And now with everyone on their own devices, kids are spending so much time isolated. And that has to have consequences for their social and emotional development.
Exactly. And that isolation feeds into some of the dangers Haidt talks about in his book. He calls them the four foundational harms. And they're all kind of intertwined. Social deprivation, sleep deprivation, attention fragmentation, and addiction. It's like this vicious cycle, you know? Social deprivation happens because kids are spending so much time online. They're missing out on those face-to-face interactions, and obviously that impacts their ability to develop social skills, which just makes it harder to connect with people offline. Then you've got sleep deprivation, often linked to that blue light from screens, messing with melatonin production.
And both Haidt and Twenge talk about the studies showing that teens today are getting way less sleep than previous generations. We all know what happens when you don't sleep enough. Your mood, your focus, even your physical health, it all takes a hit.
It's like a recipe for disaster. And then you add attention fragmentation on top of that, which is this whole other issue. I mean, we're constantly bombarded. Notifications, updates, messages, all these things designed to grab our attention. It's like we're training our brains to just constantly seek out novelty and instant gratification.
Which I guess makes it harder to focus on anything that requires,
Yeah.
you know, actual sustained attention, like reading a book
Yeah.
or having a good conversation or even just getting work done.
Exactly. And that brings us to the last of the four harms, addiction. Now, obviously, social media and video games aren't substances, but they can be just as addictive. You get that dopamine rush from likes and comments, or leveling up in a game, and it creates this really powerful feedback loop.
They can take over so quickly, it's scary. And what's even more concerning is that teenagers are especially vulnerable to addiction.
Yeah, and that's because their brains are still developing. You know, the frontal cortex, the part responsible for impulse control and long-term planning, it's still developing in adolescence. They're wired differently at that age.
So they're more likely to fall into those instant gratification traps. It's like what Haidt was saying about smartphones being experience blockers. I mean, how often do you see kids totally glued to their phones? And they're missing out on what's happening right in front of them. A beautiful sunset, a conversation with their friends, even just playing in the park.
And all those real-world experiences are so important for developing all sorts of skills, resilience, social intelligence, even just confidence in their own abilities. If kids are always plugged in, they're missing out on those opportunities.
It's almost like they're living in this perfectly curated digital world, but they're missing out on the richness and complexity of real life. And that brings us to what I think is one of Haidt's most important points, the power of play for healthy development. He contrasts the unstructured, imaginative world of play with the superstructured, rule-based world of online games and social media.
It's such an important distinction. When kids play, they experiment, they take risks, they learn boundaries, and they do it all in a safe environment. They learn to negotiate roles, resolve conflicts, develop empathy, all these essential life skills.
I love that analogy he uses about the ecosystem experiment, where they found that trees grown in a controlled environment, totally shielded from the wind, were actually weaker and more prone to disease. Turns out that wind resistance was essential for them to develop strong roots.
It's a powerful metaphor. Kids need challenges and risks to grow, just like those trees. Constant supervision and this curated online world can actually hinder that process.
Think back to your own childhood. Remember those days running around outside, building forts, playing tag, letting your imagination run wild. I bet those experiences really shaped who you are today.
Absolutely. And this leads us to the question of what can we do to reverse some of these negative trends. Haidt proposes 4 norms that he believes could have a real impact if they were widely adopted.
Yeah, he keeps it pretty straightforward. No smartphones before high school, no social media before 16, phone-free schools, and way more unsupervised play and independence. Sounds good in theory, but I can't imagine getting everyone on board with that.
It's definitely a challenge. Parents today feel so much pressure to conform to societal expectations. There's this fear that their kid will be left out if they don't have the latest gadget or social media accounts. It's understandable, but it's also contributing to the problem.
I think it comes down to collective action, like you were saying before. If a whole community of parents and schools work together to implement these norms, it becomes the new normal. It's about shifting those societal expectations.
Exactly. We need to create a culture where childhood is defined by play, exploration, real-world connection, not constant screen time and social media validation.
It's like we're building a house.
Yeah.
But we're forgetting about the foundation. You can add all the fancy features and gadgets you want, but if you don't have that solid base, the whole structure's unstable.
That's a great analogy. We need a holistic approach to raising kids. We can't just focus on their physical safety and academic achievement. Their emotional, social, and psychological needs are just as important.
If you're finding these ideas interesting and you want to learn more, I highly recommend checking out Haidt's website, anxiousgeneration.com. He's got tons of advice and resources for parents and educators who want to implement these norms.
And speaking of resources, don't forget to check out the link in the description to get your own copy of the books we're discussing today.
Yes, and while you're at it, hit that subscribe button and leave us a review. It really does help other listeners discover the podcast.
Okay, so back to Haidt's solutions. I think one of the most striking things about his book, and Twenji's too, is this idea that our obsession with safety and achievement might actually be backfiring.
It's almost like we're trying so hard to protect kids from every little risk or failure.
Yeah.
That we're actually making them more fragile, less able to deal with the challenges that life throws at them.
Like those trees again. Shielded from the wind, they ended up weaker. Maybe a little struggle is good for us, helps us build resilience, learn how to solve problems, develop a sense of self-reliance.
And it's kind of ironic, because statistically, Gen Z is the safest generation in history. They're less likely to do risky things, like drunk driving or unprotected sex. They're more likely to wear seatbelts and helmets.
And yet, they're also the generation with the highest rates of anxiety and depression. It really makes you think about the difference between safety and well-being. We can make sure kids are physically safe, but if we're not also taking care of their emotional and social needs, we're not really setting them up for success.
So are we accidentally raising kids who are physically safer, but emotionally more fragile? That's a pretty big question. Something to think about as we try to figure out this whole parenting thing.
I think these books, Generations and The Anxious Generation, offer some helpful insights. They encourage us to be more mindful about how we use technology and to set boundaries that protect our own mental and emotional well-being.
It's not about demonizing technology or going off the grid completely. It's about finding that balance, embracing the good parts of technology while being aware of the risks, making conscious choices.
Remembering that real life, with all its messiness and unpredictability, that's where real learning and growth happen.
Right. It's about encouraging our kids to put down the phones, step away from the screens, and engage with the world around them, to play, explore, discover who they are, without the constant pressure of online validation or the fear of making mistakes.
It's complicated, there's no easy answer, but these books give us a place to start the conversation.
Totally agree. And if you're interested in digging deeper, I highly recommend checking out Haidt's website, anxiousgeneration.com, and picking up a copy of Generations by Twenj. You'll find tons of practical advice and resources in both that can help us create a more balanced and fulfilling life for ourselves and the next generation. You can find links to both in the episode description.
And remember, we're all in this together. Talking to other parents, sharing your concerns, supporting each other, that's so important as we figure out how to handle these challenges.
Well, that's about it for today. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into generational differences and the impact of technology on childhood. Hope it gave you some things to think about, maybe even inspired you to make some changes in your own life.
And before we sign off, we want to leave you with this question. What if, instead of trying to create a childhood that's free from all risk and struggle, we focused on giving our kids the tools they need to navigate challenges, embrace their imperfections, and ultimately thrive in this complex and ever-changing world?
Lots to ponder there. Thanks again for listening to the Book Nook podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review. It really helps others find the show. And be sure to check the link in the description to get your copy of the books we talked about today. Until next time, happy reading.